Hello and welcome to Talking Tullahoma, a weekly podcast recapping the week's news, talking to the news makers, and looking ahead to upcoming events. I'm Kelly Lepchinsky, and today I'll be sharing a bit of Tullahoma history, both what I've gathered on my own and what's been shared by Dr. Michael Bradley. After the interview, stay tuned to hear about events that are on tap for the weeks ahead. But first, here's a look back at the week ending Friday, September 12th. Now, first up, over the previous weekend, the Manchester Arts Center held an event that was meant to keep the arts alive at that Coffee County venue, and it looks like it worked. Well, at least it worked well enough to keep the MAC afloat for another year. Now, there are still projects that need funding and updates that need attention, but the Arts Center will not close its doors, and that is good news for the many groups that use the MAC stage, including the Millennium Repertory Company and all of its youth acting guilds, area middle schools, homeschool programs, civic programs, and dance companies. Now, there are still plenty of opportunities to help, so if you'd like to do that, contact the Manchester Arts Center. In Tullahoma on Monday, the Board of Mayor and Aldermen met in regular session. It was a light agenda with no controversial votes. The ordinance to define specialty shops, which I told you about after its first reading, passed on its second reading. Funding was approved to renew city software licenses, and a waiver was granted for signs in the right-of-way for an upcoming event. And I'll tell you more about the One Day of Hope event when we get a little closer to mid-October. But the biggest news of the night was the confirmation of a new executive director for TAEDC. The Tullahoma Area Economic Development Corporation has been searching for a new leader since Winston Brooks stepped down in June. Now the search is over. The Economic Board unanimously selected lifelong Tullahoma resident Kelly North to fill the vacancy, and on Monday, the City Board confirmed her appointment. North brings with her a decade of experience, and she's expected to start work at the end of the month. Now, finally, from Monday's meeting, Alderman Kurt Glick got unanimous support on his request to enlist volunteers to help plan a local celebration of the 250th birthday of the United States. A date for a group meeting to form a committee will be set soon, so if you're interested in being part of that planning, reach out to City Hall to volunteer. Now, Alderman Glick was in the news otherwise this week when his trial date was delayed. Alderman Glick has been indicted on 2 counts of official misconduct for actions related to the months-long suspension and eventual termination of City Human Resources Director Costa Bryce. Now, I didn't have a podcast when all that started, so buckle in for some background. In May of 2021, Glick retired from his position as the head of the Parks and Recreation Department, but it's a move he says was forced by the city. Now, at the time, the city administrator was Jennifer Moody, and Moody did not deny that Glick had been asked to retire from the Parks Department. Instead, she pointed to the results of a third-party investigation that had found numerous problems with Glick's managerial style, including what it called cronyism, and actions that it claimed were discriminatory and retaliatory. Glick responded by filing a lawsuit that claimed his dismissal was discriminatory based on his age. Now, within a year, the retired parks director was elected to serve as a city alderman. The election was held in August of 2022, and by February of 2023, the HR director who had served the city for 26 years was in the crosshairs of the newly elected city board. Bryce was accused of shredding documents and was placed on leave, a leave that lasted nearly 8 months before her position was terminated. But no evidence of any wrongdoing was ever found. When the DA's investigation concluded in July of 2023, criminal charges were brought, but they weren't against Bryce, they were against Glick. Why? Well, because he didn't recuse himself from the vote that suspended Bryce. Lawyers say he should have done that because he had an active lawsuit against the city for an HR matter, the matter of his forced retirement. Now, by September of 2023, Bryce was told she did not have a job to return to. The city, which has roughly 150 full-time employees, said it had eliminated the HR director position. Now, for all of the reasons I've already mentioned, plus a charge of racial discrimination and extreme retaliation, Bryce filed her own $5 million federal lawsuit against the city. That suit was settled in her favor earlier this year. Meanwhile, Glick has yet to answer the charges against him, and he was set to get that chance next week. But the obstacles keep coming. You see, to avoid potential conflicts with familiar judges and the Coffee County DA's office, Glick's case was handed to the 31st District Court in Warren County. And now the DA in that district is facing legal trouble of his own. District Attorney Christopher Stanford faces endangerment charges after opening fire on a moving vehicle during a law enforcement action last year. And his case won't be heard before next week when Glick's trial was set to begin. So Glick's legal team is asking for a new prosecutor. Now, instead of upsetting the entire apple cart, the judge in the case says that he'll wait for the results of the DA's hearing before he makes that decision. Judge Bart Stanley will revisit the request for a new prosecutor in mid-November. Now, if you've traveled down Cedar Lane in the last week, you've seen some construction work near the NHC campus. The National Healthcare Corporation is in the early stages of a $19 million expansion. The new facility is being built next door to the existing building, and it will offer nearly 80 new living spaces for senior adults with physical or mental health care needs. Now, it's not just an expansion of acreage, it's an expansion of care, marking the difference between the around-the-clock medical care of a nursing home and the more task-driven care of an assisted living home. The former currently exists at NHC. It's the latter that's being added. Meanwhile, on South Jackson Street, keep your eyes on the historic Harton House as it undergoes at least a $250,000 renovation to restore the structure that was built in 1885. The house was recently purchased by business owner Jared Hood to serve as the new home of Access Title and Escrow. The house is significant in that it was once occupied by real estate agent John Harton, who purchased much of the land in Tullahoma in his day because, well, it wasn't suitable to grow crops, but it was perfect to grow houses. Harton served as the mayor of Tullahoma multiple times between 1912 and 1938, after which he was elected to serve as the Tennessee State Treasurer. He died in 1963 and is buried in Oakwood Cemetery. His house remained a residential structure until the death of his wife, Frances, in 1989. 5 years after her death, the house was donated to the Historic Preservation Society. Now, at the time of that donation, Harton's daughter, Alice Ratliff, was still alive, but according to her obituary, at the time of her death, she was living next door to the house she had been born in. And if her name sounds familiar to you, it should. It's because of her that the South Jackson School was saved from demolition, and it survived to become the performing arts center it is today. When Alice died in 2011, the Harton House had been in the hands of the Historic Preservation Society for 18 years. But the year after Alice's death, the society sold the building back to the Harton family, because after 19 years of ownership and on the heels of the Great Recession, they could not keep enough tenants in the building to afford the property taxes. When the Harton family bought the house back in 2012, they agreed to preserve the building for at least 10 years. The clock ran out on that agreement around 2022. And for at least a while since then, the house was a residence again. It was leased for some time to the former executive director of the Tullahoma Fine Arts Center, Joshua Cole. Now, during that time, preservation was likely not a top priority for the leasing agency. But it is clear that the Harton family had long intended to have the building preserved. That's why they donated it in the first place. Well, there's no indication that preservation was any part of the purchase agreement with Jared Hood. But we do know that Hood plans to invest heavily in its renovation, if not its restoration. And I, for one, look forward to seeing the result. Now, on Thursday, Tullahoma Police investigator Jessica Taylor and Fire Department engineer Michael McChesney were honored with the Patriot Award during the city's annual Patriot Day ceremony, remembering those who lost their lives in the 9/11 attacks. The American Legion Post 43 of Tullahoma recognized Taylor and McChesney for great deeds and exemplary service. And on Friday night, this Friday night, the 12th, the 3-0 Wildcat football team travels to Sparta to take on the 2-1 White County Warriors. And I'll leave it to our partner podcast, the Mick and Mac Show, to keep you up to date on the latest sports. But if you follow school sports, there is something that you should know. The next home football game, the 19th against Nolensville, will mark the beginning of a new policy for Tullahoma City School athletics. Starting on the 19th, the school system will enforce a new clear bag policy. Now, it's not just for football game, it's for any athletic event at the high school or middle school level. Now, if you don't already have a clear bag that you use for college sports or for concerts, you can find them easily online by searching for stadium-approved bags. The results will come back with an array of clear totes in plastic, vinyl, or PVC that are sized 12 by 6 by 12, and that is the maximum size allowed by this new policy. No other bags will be allowed, so leave your coolers, purses, duffel bags, diaper bags, fanny packs, and backpacks in the car. Now, earlier in the podcast, when I was talking about the Harton House, I explained the significance of the name Harton, but what about the name of the street it's on? Well, okay, the significance of the name Jackson doesn't take a lot of thought if you know your Tennessee or presidential history. But there are plenty of street names in Tullahoma that you might not be able to guess quite so easily. So today we're reaching into the archives once again, this time to a lunch and learn program presented by the Parks and Recreation Department. The program was held at the D.W. Wilson Community Center in 2017, and the speaker is local author and historian Dr. Michael Bradley.
The history of a town can be learned by looking at the names of its older streets. When Tullahoma was new in the mid-19th century, the names of our streets were not a mystery because the people honored by the names were well known. One of our streets, the one right in front of us here, Cedar Lane, is actually older than Tullahoma. This was here before Tullahoma was here. This was the road from the older town of Winchester over through the Flower Town community to Roseville, on the way up toward Bell Buckle, War Trace, and with a branch running over to Shelbyville. So this road is perhaps our oldest named street, and so we're in a very appropriate place to talk about historic street names in Tullahoma. Probably Cedar Lane originally followed a game trail, and later by the native inhabitants, and later by the early pioneers, and then later by people traveling on business. Very few people travel for pleasure, traveling for business back and forth among those communities. But for the rest of the town, where do these names come from, and who were these people? Well, the north-south axis of Tullahoma is, and always has been since the town was laid out, Jackson Street. Well, the origin of that name is no mystery. In the mid-19th century, every Tennessean knew Andrew Jackson. Twice President of the United States, military hero of the War of 1812, land speculator and developer, who helped to found towns all the way from Middle Tennessee to Memphis. Not a surprise there should have been a street named after Andrew Jackson. It is a little surprising that it ran toward Shelbyville, because Shelbyville inside the city limits was strongly Whig. And Andrew Jackson never, on any election, never carried Shelbyville. You will also notice that we do not have anywhere in Tullahoma in the historic area an Adams Street or a Clay Street. When Andrew Jackson ran for president the first time, his opponents were John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay. No one won on the popular vote or even in the Electoral College. The vote had to go to the House of Representatives as provided for in the Constitution. Shortly before that House of Representatives vote, John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay had a secret meeting, after which Clay announced that his supporters should vote for John Quincy Adams. And that did it. John Quincy Adams won, but Jackson never stopped running, and he never forgot, and he certainly never forgave. The story is told that on his deathbed. Now, in the 19th century, if you were dying, they didn't mess around with this. They said, buddy, if there's anything you want to do, you better do it right now, because you ain't going to be here much longer. And they usually ask the minister to come in and tell you that, I suppose, in case there was anything you needed to say to the minister. So the story is that the pastor of Rachel's church, Hermitage Presbyterian, came in and said, now, President Jackson, you know you're dying. Yes. You know you don't have long. Yes. Is there anything you would like to say before you die? Yes. Something you regret? Yes. Well, you can see the preacher's eyes light up. He was going to get Old Hickory's deathbed confession. Well, God is merciful, President Jackson. What is it you wish to say? I regret I never shot that good-for-nothing Henry Clay. So not surprising, we do not have a Clay Street or an Adams Street in the historic area. Next over is Atlantic Street. Now, where in the world did that name come? Everything else in the old historic district is named for a person. Why in the world should we suddenly have a street named for an ocean? Well, it's the railroad. Incidentally, Atlantic Street, I've been told, is the widest street in the world because it runs from the old post office, now the annex of First Christian Church, to the old bus station, now the annex of First Baptist Church. All that is Atlantic Street. Wider than the Champs-Élysées, only we don't have an arch at the end of ours, we have an overpass. But when the railroad was being built, the Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad would connect with the Memphis and Charleston Railroad so that we would have connections all the way to the Atlantic Ocean, hence Atlantic Street. This meant all at once strange and exotic things would begin to appear in the stores in Tullahoma. Things like bananas, oranges, pineapples, and on some occasions, barrels with oysters packed in ice. Life was about to become very interesting, and incidentally, your social opportunities were no longer limited to the girl next door. You could travel all the way to Cowan to find a new girlfriend. Then, as we move one beyond Atlantic Street, we find Polk. Well, no mystery there either. Another Tennessee president, and one who expanded our territory all the way to the Pacific. So we have Polk to remind us of Pacific and Atlantic to remind us of the Atlantic. We now are on the verge of expanding coast to coast, fulfilling what they called our manifest destiny. Remember, Polk had been president only a few years before Tullahoma was founded. So I am quite positive that most of the people here in Tullahoma had actually voted for Polk. He carried his home state by a pretty sizable majority, and his memory was still fresh in the minds of many people. Also, the Polk family still had influence locally. Polk had a relative named Leonidas Polk, who happened to be the Episcopal Bishop of Louisiana, who happened to be interested in founding a little college up on the top of the mountain. Anderson Street is the next in line, and today hardly anybody remembers Charles Anderson, Vice President of the Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad. Anderson lived near Murfreesboro at a place appropriately called Anderson Station. Now that solved his commuting problem. Being Vice President of the road, he said, we're going to put a station right here. You stop there every morning and I'll ride into work. So off you go. He had actually served as a combat officer during the Civil War, resumed his railroad work and rebuilt the line following the war, and incidentally, his descendants still live in this area. Running east to west is Moore Street, a quiet residential area which is named for William Moore, an officer in the War of 1812, a friend of Andrew Jackson, a state legislator, and Attorney General of the state of Tennessee, as well as the man for whom Moore County is named. Now, as if historical research is not confusing enough at times, Attorney General Moore is always listed in the records of the state of Tennessee as simply General Moore. So if you're not careful, you find yourself looking for a military figure instead of a legal figure, but his office was that of Attorney General of the state of Tennessee. Hogan Street is next. It's named for that world-famous wrestler, Hulk. I learned long ago, if you don't know anything, you should make up something and you get away with it. Actually, Hogan was the town doctor in the 1850s. He was not one of the stockholders in the town corporation, but since he was the town doctor, they named the street for him. His house was up on the eastern end of that street, and it's marked on several of the old city maps as Hogan's Well. Apparently there was a place there where you could water horses at his well. And if you will look very carefully at the geography of the town, you'll find a drainage ditch which used to be Hogan's Creek. It runs now largely underground in culverts, but occasionally it comes to the surface and runs through an above-ground drainage ditch. So the doctor left town. I don't know why, but he left town before 1860. He is not found in the 1860 census. Perhaps not enough people got sick in Tullahoma and he moved elsewhere. This was, after all, considered to be a health resort. Grundy Street. Now, for most people, I suspect Grundy Street is associated only with Grundy County, and they have no idea where that name came from either. But in the 19th century, Felix Grundy was a very prominent Tennessean. He was a national figure, a U.S. representative, U.S. senator, prominent criminal lawyer, Chief Justice of the state Supreme Court, supporter of Andrew Jackson, and leader of the Democratic Party in the state of Tennessee. He overdid himself actively campaigning for Jackson's successor, Martin Van Buren, and died of a heart attack in 1840. Since he was a hero to the people of his day, when Tullahoma was founded, Grundy Street was named for Felix Grundy. Lincoln Street. No, that is not that, Mr. Lincoln. First of all, why would you think anybody in Middle Tennessee would name a street for that, Mr. Lincoln? Particularly at that time. Well, actually, when Tullahoma was founded, that Mr. Lincoln was an unheard of, unknown Illinois legislator who was just on the verge of running for and losing a race for the United States Senate. He had not yet been heard of. Lincoln Street is named for a rebel general. No, not that war. That other war where we had a bunch of rebels. The one where the British called us rebels. Actually, I expect they called us worse than that. But Benjamin Lincoln is the namesake of Lincoln Street. Benjamin Lincoln was the commander of the Continental Forces. Remember, the word American was not used until well after the War of Independence. Benjamin Lincoln was the commander of the Continental Forces in the southern sector, defender of the city of Charleston, unsuccessfully I might add. He was forced to surrender, but was exchanged and then became second in command of the Continental Army at Yorktown. Now, when Lord Cornwallis surrendered the British forces at Yorktown, he suddenly found himself not feeling well, so he sent his second in command, General O'Hara, out to turn over his sword to George Washington. And when Washington saw an officer inferior in rank approaching, he sent out his second in command, Benjamin Lincoln, to accept the sword. So in the famous picture, Washington at Yorktown, Washington is sitting here on his horse, a red-headed guy, obviously an Irishman, General O'Hara, is offering a sword hilt first, and an American officer, a Continental officer, stretching out his hands to receive it is Benjamin Lincoln. The county is also named for Benjamin Lincoln. Benjamin Lincoln died without ever having set foot here in Tennessee. Now, Lincoln Street, for a great many years, was the primary east-west axis of the town. And remember, the extension of Lincoln Street is still called the Old Manchester Highway. It was the Manchester Highway until Camp Forest was being built in the 1940s. And there was so much traffic, people traveling for construction purposes from Manchester to Tullahoma to help build Camp Forest, that road actually became one way. When shifts were about to begin, it was one way from Manchester to Tullahoma, and when the shift was over, it was one way from Tullahoma back to Manchester. So in 1942, the new road was built to accommodate the flow of traffic. So Lincoln Street began to become more of a residential rather than the east-west axis of the town. Going one block further over is Lauderdale Street, named for another associate of Andrew Jackson, William Lauderdale. He was an officer in the War of 1812 and again in the Creek War. His brother, James Lauderdale, was also a friend of Jackson's. William Lauderdale favored James K. Polk's policy of expansion of our national territory. William Lauderdale is probably better known in Florida than he is here. You've been there on vacation. Yep, Fort Lauderdale, Florida is named for the same guy that our street is named for. Two other streets which developed early on in the history of Tullahoma are Jefferson and Franklin. Now you may notice that these early streets, which are named for presidents, are all named for Democrats. Well, there was no Republican Party until 1856. And from 1856 until about 1960, the word Republican was associated with another four-letter term, which is also a prefix for the word Yankee. Well, until the 1960s, the Republican Party in the state of Tennessee held its annual convention in a telephone booth. That's not a joke, that's the truth. Dwight Eisenhower started to make that change, by the way. My grandfather was one of those yeller dog Democrats, and he said, however, in 1952 that he was going to vote for Eisenhower because Ike and his boys had all been in the Army together. Of course, his boys had been enlisted personnel, and Eisenhower, the commander-in-chief, they'd all been in the Army together. They were voting at the junior high school I attended at the time, and I saw my granddaddy come out of the gym where the voting booth was, and I went over to him and I said, "Granddaddy, did you do it? Did you vote for Eisenhower?" He said, "Son, I went in that voting booth and I drew the curtain, there was nobody there but me and God Almighty, and I saw that dad-blame elephant and I could not do it." So, not surprisingly, these early presidential street names in Tullahoma were all Democrats, so Jefferson is an easy choice. But what about Franklin? He's not a president. Well, Benjamin Franklin has always been something of a favorite in Tennessee. Remember, very early in our history, we were part of North Carolina. We felt we were neglected by North Carolina. So in the 18th century, Tennessee seceded from North Carolina and founded the state of Franklin, which had a very short history. But Benjamin Franklin remained a favorite, and so it's not surprising that we should find a Franklin Street in Tennessee as well. There's one other short and very obscure street in Tullahoma that I want to mention that has a very historic name. That's Catron Street. Does anybody know where Catron Street is? 2 blocks long, one on one side of the railroad, one on the other side of the railroad. It does not cross the railroad. Catron Street is named for Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court, John Catron. He had a summer house here in Tullahoma. John Catron became well known. I debated whether to say famous or infamous, so I'll leave it up to you to choose which one you'd like. I'll say well known, because he was in the majority on the Dred Scott case, which said slavery is protected by the Constitution. His house was over on Franklin Street. There's nothing left there except the curbing of the well, but there is a historical marker pointing out where the house stayed. Now, when the Civil War started, Catron, like all the other Southern justices on the Supreme Court, stayed in Washington and retained his seat on the Supreme Court. So when the Confederate Army came to Tullahoma, they occupied Catron's house because they did not like Catron. He'd stayed in the North. When the U.S. Army came to Tullahoma, they occupied Catron's house. They didn't like him because he had voted for the Dred Scott ruling. No wonder the house didn't survive. And I suppose no wonder we don't have a very long street named for John Catron. But John Catron has the distinction of being the highest ranking government officer ever to be associated with Tullahoma that has a street named for him. He actually lived here, at least during the summertime. So the next time you go to visit your neighbor, or the next time you run errands, or the next time you go to church, don't just ask the address. Ask yourself, who was this person down whose namesake street I'm driving? You may learn something very interesting.
You're getting a lot of bang for your history buck today on the podcast, but now we're going to move forward in time a little bit to 1975 and switch to fiction while we're at it. A couple of weeks ago, I told you that when Kathy Rose and I sit down to talk about books, it could be a whole podcast of its own. So I limited our last segment to our discussion of author Wally Lamb. But when Kathy was here, we also talked about her introduction to a British author. Chris Whitaker's book, All the Colors of the Dark, was published in June of 2024, and it was soon a New York Times bestseller.
Main character is, I believe he and the girl, I've totally forgotten the girl's name. She's got an unusual name like Star or Starry or something like that. But anyway, they're both kind of the outcasts in their school. And the boy's name is Patch. Or that's what everybody calls him.
Okay.
He was born with only one eye. And so his mother makes him a variety of patches to wear over that opening. And I mean, she decorates them and she fixes them all up. Now she's got issues. She struggles, but she makes sure that Patch has got just, something beautifully decorated to go over his eye. Well, at some point, Patch in his childhood becomes obsessed with the idea of pirates.
Okay.
And he knows, is this ringing a bell?
No, I don't think I have read it.
And so he knows the history of all these different pirates. And the girl who's friends with him, she goes along with it, and is into the whole thing. Well, one day, and I'm not sure exactly where Patch was headed, but he had cut through some woods to get there, and the most beautiful girl in town, who was the daughter of the richest people in town, is being assaulted by this man. He is trying to get her. There have been some girls who have gone missing. He is trying to get her into his vehicle, and Patch comes along and is able to distract him long enough where the girl can get away. And Patch is taken. And there is no sign of him anywhere. Well, the girl who is his friend, she will not give up. She has a relationship with the sheriff. And because I think at one time maybe the sheriff was, he kind of looked out after her because mother's pretty sketchy. So, she keeps after him, and she keeps looking for Patch. 10 months later, they find him. And it is the revealing of what happened to him in those 10 months, because he was kept in a room where he was in total darkness. But there is a girl who comes in and talks to him. He never sees her, doesn't have any idea what she looks like. And she talks to him about, she sounds trite to say, but she keeps his spirits up. She keeps him going. She tells him about all of the different places she's been and all the different things that she has seen. And he can tell by the detail, she's not making it up. She's really been these places. And when he is finally rescued after 10 months, there is no sign of this girl. He has no proof that she ever existed. People believe that she was just a fantasy that he made up. And he pretty much makes it his mission in life to try to find her, and in the process tries to find other young women who have gone missing with the same MO. And it's just a really good story. It's the friendship between him and the childhood playmate, and the love between the two of them. It is his a talent he doesn't realize that he has, that develops, that gives him a whole new aspect to his life. But it is that grim determination, because he knows that girl was real, and he has to. Her name is Grace, very, very appropriate name. He is determined. She is out there, she is alive, and he is going to find her.
If you want to find out whether he does find her, you'll want to get a copy of the book, which you can do for free at the Lanham Library. Now, if you don't already have a library card, well, it's easy to get one, and that's free too. Your library card unlocks a whole world of entertainment, from books, ebooks, and audiobooks to CDs, DVDs, and the library of things. It also gives you access to services like printing and copying. September is library card sign-up month, so this is the perfect time to stop in and get that done. Oh, and by the way, the unusual name of Patch's childhood friend is Saint. And now, here's a look at what's happening. Grab a chair or a blanket and visit South Jackson's patio stage on Thursday the 18th for a Midsummer Night's Swing featuring the South Jackson Street Band. The annual ice cream social begins with a dance class at 6 o'clock, and the band strikes up in earnest at 7. Adult admission is $10, and you can get your tickets online at southjackson.org. The Friends of Short Springs will gather on Saturday morning the 20th for another workday in the natural area. Meet at 8 o'clock in the Short Springs parking lot and bring work gloves and water with you. The group recently completed a step restoration project on a slope that leads to Machine Falls. The next project will be announced soon. For more information, find the Friends of Short Springs on Facebook. After cleaning up the park, clean out your garage. Grab all those unwanted, toxic, corrosive, and reactive chemicals for the house, car, lawn, or garden and dispose of them at Public Works. The household hazardous waste collection will begin at 8 o'clock Saturday morning, the 20th, and it will continue until 1. If you have any questions, call Public Works at 454-1768. The 8th annual Oktoberfest will take over the grounds at South Jackson on Saturday, the 27th. Admission is free, and there will be food, games, and fun for the whole family starting at 10 a.m. You can start practicing your yodeling now. The Friends of the Coffee County Libraries will host a craft fair on the Storybook Trail in October. The proceeds will help fund a wildlife project in the yard that's just behind the Lanham Library. You'll hear more about library projects soon, but booth space is limited, and those applications for a $45 vendor space are available now. So go ahead and pick one up at the Lanham Library. And finally, now is the time to submit your nomination for the Grand Marshal of the 2025 Tullahoma Christmas Parade. If there's someone that you'd like to see honored this year, submit their name to the Tullahoma Area Chamber of Commerce. Nominations will be open through October 7th, and the honoree will be announced at the Chamber Membership Coffee later that month. And that's what's happening. Thank you so much for joining me for this edition of Talking Tullahoma. If you've got a story or an event that you'd like to share on the podcast, call and leave me a message at 571-7186 or email news@lighttube.net. I'll be back soon with more of what makes Tullahoma tick. Until then, you can listen to Talking Tullahoma on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Music. New episodes drop on Thursdays. Please rate and review. For the video version, follow us on YouTube. Just search for TUA LightTube. I'm Kelly Lepchinsky. Catch you next week.